In 1977, the murder of an elderly socialite in Miami drew national headlines, not because of who she was, but because of who allegedly shot her, a teenager, whose defense lawyer said was driven to the crime by his addiction to television, and specifically, one particular episode of the cop show Kojak inspired him to pull the trigger. We'll delve into the story and try to find out exactly what episode of Kojak led to a real-life murder, next on Dark Tube TV's Wicked History, presented by Best Eps. On June 8, 1977, members of the local women's club in Miami called the police. Their friend and past club vice president, 83-year-old Eleanor Haggart, hadn't shown up for a meeting, and it was so unlike her. Miami police officer Zell Hall approached Haggart's home at 4515 Royal Palm Avenue and observed a few smashed windows. Going inside, he found the place ransacked and found Eleanor Haggart lying dead on her living room floor, having been shot through the abdomen. As police swarmed this quiet Miami Beach street, Haggart's next-door neighbor, 15-year-old Ronald Albert Zamora, confessed to his parents that he had killed Eleanor 4 days earlier, but he hadn't meant to. During his confession to detectives, Ronney explained he and his pal, 14-year-old Daryl Agrella, had meant only to rob the lady of her cash and jewels, but she surprised them in the act. When she threatened to call the police, Zamora shot her with her own .32 caliber handgun, covering her face with a chiffon robe, before stealing $415 in cash and the keys to her '72 Buick. Afterwards, Zamora reportedly told a psychiatrist that he, quote, wished the shooting had been like a TV show where the dead get up when the show is over. It just so happened that one of Zamora's school friends, Kim Rubin, was the daughter of noted Florida defense attorney Ellis Rubin. Rubin was always a sucker for lost causes and took up Zamora's case, immediately requesting Ronney and Daryl get separate trials. This motion was approved by Judge Paul Baker. The next motion was to throw out Ronney's written and oral confessions. It seems Detective Lieutenant Bert Bernstein failed to notify Ronney's parents before questioning the boy. That motion was denied. Rubin further requested that his client be tried as a young offender, but this was also denied. 15-year-old Ronald Zamora would be tried as an adult. And though execution was off the table, a life in prison was still up for grabs. Hoping to give his young client the best possible defense, and perhaps hoping to bring some attention to the boy's case, Rubin devised an unusual defense strategy: temporary insanity by reason of television. TV, Rubin said, conditioned Ronney Zamora to commit murder. And his reasoning was pretty simple. If you and I can be influenced by a short commercial to buy a product, certainly an hour-long commercial for murder could influence this boy. Now, Rubin is no stranger to headline-grabbing defense strategies, but this involuntary television intoxication tact was a new one, and it certainly did pique the interest of the national media.
Television was at the center of things as arguments began in an unusual Miami murder trial today, the defense claiming insanity from overexposure to TV violence.
In press interviews pre-trial, Rubin characterized Zamora as a disturbed young man whose only crime was his addiction to television. Even the prosecution's own psychologists kind of agreed with this assessment. After their sessions with Ronney, they discovered he had been watching 6 hours of television per day since he came to America with his mother from Costa Rica at the age of 3. Television was his babysitter, as his mom and stepfather worked day and night. TV eventually taught the boy how to speak English. But as he grew up in front of the TV set, the shows Ronney gravitated toward became more adult. He went from enjoying the adventures of Superman and Batman to absolutely loving the gritty cop shows of the 70s. Police Story, SWAT, Beretta, Starsky and Hutch, and especially Kojak. So when the time came to pull the trigger of that .32, Ronney subconsciously thought that it was okay to do so, simply because he had seen so many people do it on TV. Now if you're saying, you're not alone. But it's important to point out here that Rubin's strategy also wasn't all that novel. He didn't really come up with this defense off the top of his head, but rather sought to create a kind of coalescence in the public's consciousness. During the mid-70s, the media, and especially watchdog parent groups, had been hammering the networks over the amount of violent images on the small screen. Most recently, there were even folks who were up in arms over the violence in the groundbreaking miniseries Roots. Rubin believed the social environment was ripe enough to bring television to bear for this crime. He was going to put TV itself on trial, which in this case is kind of ironic, because the trial itself was going to be broadcast on television. Early on, it was decided the Zamora case would be one of the first trials in Florida history, in U.S. history, to permit TV cameras in the courtroom. Televised trials were deemed to be an experiment under Florida's new Sunshine Law, which aimed to air out the stuffiness of legal proceedings by opening a window into the courtroom for the public. During pre-trial, Rubin paraded a bevy of experts to bear witness about the effects of TV violence on the minds of children. Then he went so far as to put Kojak star Telly Savalas on the witness list, a move that made national news. Before Judge Baker, Rubin argued that popular cop shows like Kojak had warped Zamora's thinking that shooting someone was no big deal. Ronney, Rubin said, had, quote, acted under the influence of prolonged, intense, involuntary, subliminal television intoxication, and that such shows had brainwashed him into living in a television fantasy world. Specifically, he cited that, quote, Ronney's explanation of the crime was exactly what I had seen on Kojak a year earlier, further explaining that a fourth season episode bore striking similarities to the murder of Eleanor Haggart, but we will get to that in a moment. On September 1st, 1977, Telly Savalas was presiding over a Telly look-alike contest at a Miami men's store when a process server sidled up to him and handed him the subpoena to appear in Judge Baker's courtroom. As he pored over the papers, that moment happened to be captured by a photographer from the Associated Press. Later, Savalas told reporters he would honor the subpoena and added that he somewhat agreed with Rubin's strategy. Sure, he said. Kids these days grow up on Bang Bang, You're Dead. They always did. In my day, though, parents set us straight. My mother once busted my BB gun. Savalas also stated in other interviews that he asked producers to tone down the violence on his own show. During his deposition, however, Savalas was also quick to point out that Kojak was a good guy, not a bad guy. I mean, this was a few decades before the anti-heroes of the platinum age of television. So Savalas said he couldn't see how his show Kojak could be held responsible. But more importantly, perhaps, he also couldn't recall any past episode of his show that had the storyline Rubin seemed to remember. Kojak executive producer James McAdams said he pored over past scripts of the show to find the offending scene, but came up empty. As Savalas said to Scholastic Search magazine, he's got the wrong show, baby. No, he didn't say baby. I just added that in. But perhaps this shrug of denial prompted Judge Baker to shrug off Rubin's entire defense strategy, because shortly thereafter, he struck out Savalas' deposition and disallowed the majority of Rubin's expert witnesses from testifying on Zamora's behalf. Rubin was incensed by this decision. Your Honor, he complained, involuntary television intoxication is a new defense, but so was insanity at one time a new defense. Baker was unmoved by the plea. Once the trial got underway in late September of '77, Rubin's only real witnesses to Ronney's TV habits were his mother, who testified she had no choice but to put Ronney in front of the television all day because she was afraid of him getting in trouble out in the world. And psychologist Michael M. Gilbert, who said on the stand, quote, well, this boy has been exposed to thousands and thousands of situations where he has seen, when you're threatened, bang, shoot. This is an emotionally disturbed child who never held a gun in his hand before, but who was conditioned that the proper thing to do was to shoot it. Now, to make matters worse, no one in the media could find, or maybe even bothered to find, that one episode of Kojak Rubin said supposedly resembled this crime. That one episode that had prompted Zamora to flash back to it in the aftermath of his confrontation with Eleanor Haggart. That one episode that told him it was okay to pull the trigger that June night. Because Rubin had his strategy essentially thrown out, he never got to show that one episode to the court. Some in the media questioned whether it existed at all. But it did exist. It does exist. And it also happens to be one of the show's best episodes. During interviews before the trial, Savalas and his producers were kinda correct. There is no fourth season episode of Kojak that mirrors the real-life murder of Eleanor Haggart. A break-in late at night, a confrontation, a gunshot. But there is an episode called Kojak's Days, which aired February 7th, 1977, just 4 months before the murder. Now, this two-part episode serves as a kind of day in the life of the detective, and it is, by the way, chock full of gunfire. But of the many stories in this multi-narrative, one of which actually includes a young William Hurt, is a plot involving a teenage boy, Scott Firestone, and his drug-addicted mother. At the 26-minute mark of Part 2, a teenager enters the squad room. yelling at the now-arrested drug dealer who got his mom hooked. He cries that the man ruined his mom's life, and then he produces a small revolver. Kojak tells the boy to put the gun down, but it goes off, sending the drug dealer sprawling to the floor, dead. Now, while that may not resemble Eleanor Haggart's murder, what happens in the aftermath is that Kojak comes over to the kid, gently takes the gun, and puts his arm around his shoulder, comforting him. It was Rubin's argument that this actual scene told Ronney that shooting someone is no big deal, because even Kojak would be on his side if he did. The character of Kojak was, after all, Ronney's absolute hero. His mother testified on the stand that he begged his stepfather to shave his head just like Savalas. So if Kojak is okay with him shooting someone, it must be okay, right? Now, because Judge Baker kneecapped Rubin's defense before the trial even began, the jury never got to see this scene. Perhaps if they had, Rubin's television insanity ploy might have worked. Here was a deeply disturbed young man influenced by something he saw on television. If Ellis had been allowed to play Kojak's days in court, maybe things would have turned out differently for Ronney Zamora, and maybe the implication, proving a direct link from a TV episode to a murder, would have reverberated more strongly throughout the television industry. Instead, the television intoxication defense crumbled. At the end of the 9-day trial, during closing arguments, Rubin tried in vain to bolster his hypothesis. To the jury, he characterized TV as Ronney's instructor, his brainwasher, his hypnotizer. He urged the jury to get justice for Eleanor by holding television accountable for the crimes of Ronney and others like him. It was up to them, he said, to stop the insanity. Your verdict is going to say this woman's life was not taken in vain, because your verdict is the day that began to stop. The prosecution was a little less verbose, with attorney Thomas Headley simply ridiculing the defense strategy and wondering what was next. Insanity pleas based on the violent readings in the newspaper, history books, the Bible. After closing arguments, the jury went off to confer. But it didn't take long. They came back less than 2 hours later.
We, the jury at Miami-Dade County, Florida, this 6th day of October, A.D. 1977, find the defendant, Ronney Albert Zamora, as to count 1 of the indictment, guilty of murder in the first degree. So say we all.
Observed the New York Times, the jury's rejection of the boy's unusual defense did not put an end to the debate about television and the visual mayhem that it serves up day after day, program after program. For his part, Telly Savalas retreated from his earlier seeming support of Rubin. I think there has to be a dimension of illness within anybody who's capable of committing a homicide, he told the LA Times. The boy is sick, and television has nothing to do with it. Ronney Zamora was eventually sentenced to 25 years in prison, but his case was far from over. When Rubin's appeal fell short, he and Zamora's family filed a $25 million civil suit against all 3 U.S. networks, charging they had colluded to commit fraud and misrepresentation by, quote, inducing children to commit violent acts. Around the same time, a case was traveling through the California court system, taking NBC to task for a sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl by a group of other girls, a crime, it was alleged, that was born from an idea the girls saw in the 1974 NBC movie of the week, Born Innocent, starring Linda Blair. In the end, both the Born Innocent case and the Kojak case were tossed out by judges, essentially saying that TV networks could not be held responsible for the actions of others based on what they aired in primetime. Still, though the networks escaped virtually scot-free, they did listen to calls of public opinion in the late 70s and began to kind of clean up their act. By 1982, a year after the Zamora and Born Innocent civil decisions, shoot-'em-up cop shows had all but disappeared from the network's lineups, replaced instead by cheery sitcoms, dynastic soaps, and will they won't they private eyes. When Zamora's new lawyer filed an appeal to overturn Ronney's conviction due to the incompetence of Rubin's wacky defense, that appeal was rejected, with a 3-judge panel going on record to say Rubin kinda didn't have much choice. The prosecution's case was just so overwhelming. Rubin, they said, at least had to try something. Yet perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Zamora case is its status as one of the first trials to be completely televised from start to finish. Sure, there had been film trials before, But the media circuses they caused led to the U.S. Supreme Court to ban cameras in the courts in 1965. With the success broadcasting-wise of this Zamora trial on TV, its ratings on WPBT in Miami topped The Tonight Show and Kojak that week, the Florida Supreme Court decided to extend its Sunshine Experiment indefinitely, giving TV viewers a gallery seat for such trials as that of Ted Bundy in 1980 and the in-court carnival 20 years later with the hanging Chad election recall. As for that episode of Kojak, today it is available on DVD and on some streaming platforms. That is, if you think you're strong enough while watching it not to be swayed that it's okay to kill.